Howdy do, how we doing? Ready to learn about titles, hooks, and transitions? Good, I'm ready to teach, so let's get started. We'll start with hooks and transitions and get into titles later. So, what about these things? What should the first couple of sentences in my essay do? Your hook is the first sentence your readers will read, and it should convince them to read the rest of your essay because your hook should be powerful and interesting. Your transition starts with the sentence after your hook, and it should keep the reader interested and introduce essential ideas or elements from the text and mention the author and title as well. The hook is a bit tricky, so here are some pointers. Your hook should be relevant to real life. It should be interesting to the average person. This means you should not mention the title or the text or anything about it just yet, because you can't be sure that the average person is interested in the same text. One of the ways to be interesting is to be controversial. If people are used to arguing about a topic, they are more likely to see whether or not you agree or disagree with them, so they might continue reading your essay. Another way to make your hook interesting is to write about something that is profound, or at least relevant to a profound idea. If your reader feels like they're learning something right away, they may decide to continue on to your second sentence. The other important aspect of a hook is that it is relevant to your thesis. This means you'll have to focus on the most interesting or relevant arguments or ideas from your thesis. Your thesis will have several different complex ideas or arguments, but you should try to narrow down your ideas to the ones that will matter most to the average person when writing your hook. We'll get into some example hooks in a minute, but any example hook is going to need an example thesis. So we'll use the same thesis we've used from the last few lessons. Here it is one more time. The actions of Atticus Finch teach us that humility will create influence over people who would otherwise be uninterested. Intelligence inspires respect from a community, but idealism can cloud a person's judgment. The most controversial and interesting part of this thesis is that it criticizes Atticus for his idealism, suggesting that it clouds his judgment. This will be the focus for the example hooks coming up. There are three common kinds of hooks. First, we'll look at the cliché or truism, which is a statement based on something obvious or taken for granted. An example of a truism for our thesis about Atticus might be, most people would give up anything for their ideals. This statement manages to connect to the critical portion of the thesis, but it's also controversial, and it speaks to something that the average person would have an opinion about. So let's take a look at another common type of hook, the question. Questions can be effective because they engage a reader's beliefs directly. As an example of a question hook, we might see something like, how far would you go to protect your ideas? This question gets the reader thinking about the topic of idealism immediately, and they may want to know if your opinions on the topic line up with theirs. The last type of hook I'll discuss here is probably the trickiest, the quotation. The quotation must be from a famous source, not your friends or family, unless they're famous too. Just like any quotation used in your body paragraphs, a quotation hook must have quote weaving where the quotation's author is introduced. Like all other types of hooks, your quotation must be relevant to your thesis. This means that simply using a Google search to find a full page of quotations that use the same word as your thesis and picking the first one will not work well. You must consider the meaning of the quotation and be able to explain the connection between the idea in the quotation and the idea in your thesis. The best I could find for a quotation on the topic of idealism was this one. Famous author Pearl S. Buck once suggested that life without idealism is empty indeed. We just hope or starve. It's important to note that this sentence has more than the quotation itself, or simply has the quotation followed by a dash in the author's name. The author of the quote is named, she has a verb describing the way in which the quotation was said, and there is an explanation of why she is important. These parts are essential for a decent quotation hook. So we've covered hooks. Let's talk about transitions. The first thing your transition should do, is explain the focus of your hook more thoroughly so that it doesn't seem random. If you move too quickly from a hook to the text or your argument, your reader will not be able to understand how they connect. Your transition should make that connection clear. The next thing your transition should do is mention the text and relevant elements in the text. In most cases, you'll only need to mention the title of the text and its author and how the text is relevant to the ideas in your hook. But if your essay focuses on a character or two, then you should mention the names of those characters as well. Let's take a look at how these transitions might work, following the examples of hooks from earlier in this video. If you're using the truism hook, most people would give up anything for their ideals, then a successful transition might look something like this. Making sacrifices to defend what is right takes courage that most people around the world aspire to. Atticus Finch from Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird faces a similar challenge to fight an impossible battle to protect his ideals. First, this transition explains what is important about the ideas in the hook. Secondly, it establishes the connection between the hook and the text. Nice. Next, we'll look at how the transition from the question hook, how we'll transition, from the question hook, which was, how far would you go to protect your ideals? A transition from that might say something like, this question cuts to the core of a person's central beliefs. Asking this question of Atticus Finch of Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird reveals a powerful revelation about his character. Just like the previous example, the first sentence of this transition elaborates on the hook, and the second sentence explains how the hook connects to the text, mentioning the title, author, and central character. Finally, let's look at a transition away from a quotation hook. Remember this hook that stated, the famous author Pearl S. Buck once suggested that life without idealism is empty indeed. We just hope or starve. To transition away from this hook and into your essay, you might write something like, idealism inspires greatness in many of us, but Atticus Finch of Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird proves that sometimes idealism can go too far. This transition is a bit different because it manages to combine the part that elaborates on the hook with the part that introduces the text into one sentence. This is tricky, but it can be done if your elaboration and introduction to the text are short enough. So let's take a minute and talk about titles. Your titles should relate to the important or controversial idea in your thesis. There should be an obvious connection between the title and thesis. Your title should be as short as possible. 4 or 5 words should be your maximum for most essays. Finally, just like your hook, your title should grab your reader's attention. The hook and the title work together to get someone to start reading your essay. Whether or not they start or whether or not they continue depends on your ability to write something that is interesting or something that matters. Some example titles for the thesis hooks and transitions from this lesson might be The Edge of Idealism or Idealism's Edge. The meanings of these titles are not super obvious, which makes them mysterious or intriguing. Who knew that idealism had an edge? There's a certain chance that the reader might want to find out what the author means by this, so they may want to read the first sentence to find out. Then your hook can do its job. So let's wrap this up. Hooks should grab your reader's attentions. Common types of hooks are cliches or truisms, questions, and quotations. Transitions should encourage your reader to keep reading, and they should introduce the text. Finally, titles should convince your reader that your essay is worth reading in the first place. That does it for now. Check the link below for a document with the example hooks and transitions with some notes on how they work. Hope you enjoy this, and I'll see you in class. This is Mr. Weir, signing off.